At dawn on June 5, 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard his flagship Yamato, hundreds of miles west of Midway Atoll, staring at a situation he had never planned for. The radio traffic was confused, fragmented, alarming. One carrier was gone. Then another. Akagi Kaga Soryu. 3 fleet carriers destroyed in a single morning. And as Yamamoto absorbed the reports, a final message arrived. Hiryu, the last operational carrier, was burning and would not survive the day. For the first time since the war began, Japan's architect of naval strategy understood something had gone catastrophically wrong. In less than 24 hours, Japan would lose 4 irreplaceable carriers, over 3,000 elite sailors and aircrew, and the core of its offensive striking power. The losses could not be rebuilt. The initiative could not be recovered. From this moment forward, Japan would fight a war it could no longer win. This is the story of the moment Admiral Yamamoto realized that Midway had not merely failed, but had shattered Japan's entire war plan. To understand why this realization mattered so deeply, we need to understand what Yamamoto believed before Midway, and why he feared this outcome more than anyone else in Japan. To understand why Midway struck Yamamoto so deeply, we need to go back, not to 1942, but to the man himself, and the belief that haunted him long before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. Isoroku Yamamoto was not a reckless gambler. That is the first misconception to discard. He was 58 years old in 1942, a career naval officer who had studied at Harvard, lived in the United States, and spoke fluent English. He had crossed America by train, watched its factories operate, and seen its cities stretch endlessly beyond the horizon. Yamamoto admired American culture, but he feared American industry. More than any other senior Japanese officer, Yamamoto understood a fundamental truth. Japan could not win a long war against the United States. He said so repeatedly. In private conversations and internal memoranda, Yamamoto warned Japan's political leadership that war with America was a race Japan would lose over time. Japan lacked oil. It lacked steel. It lacked the industrial depth to replace ships, aircraft, and trained crews at the rate the United States could. If war came, Yamamoto argued, Japan would have only a narrow window, perhaps 6 months, to strike decisive blows and force America to negotiate. After that, Japan would be ground down. This belief placed Yamamoto in an impossible position. He opposed war with the United States, but once war became inevitable, he was the one man capable of planning Japan's only plausible path to victory. That path rested on a single, dangerous idea. Destroy the American fleet early. Cripple American morale. Force a political settlement before American industry could fully mobilize. Pearl Harbor was the opening act of that strategy. It was never meant to win the war outright, it was meant to buy time. And for 6 months, it appeared to work. Between December 1941 and May 1942, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific. Hong Kong fell. Singapore collapsed. The Philippines were crushed. Wake Island, once dismissed as insignificant, became a symbol of Japanese dominance. American naval power seemed broken, scattered, humiliated. Each victory reinforced a dangerous assumption inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, that America had already been psychologically defeated. But Yamamoto did not share that confidence. He watched American responses carefully. He saw ship repair crews working around the clock at Pearl Harbor. He saw American carriers, supposedly sunk or crippled, return to action with alarming speed. He saw something else too. The United States had not asked for peace. Instead, it mobilized. American shipyards expanded. Aircraft production surged. New carriers were already under construction. Yamamoto understood what many of his colleagues did not. Every month the war continued, Japan's relative strength declined. This is where Midway enters the story, not as a gamble born of arrogance, but as a calculated attempt to end the war on Japan's terms before it was too late. Yamamoto's plan was complex, even by Japanese naval standards. It called for deception, dispersal, and timing so precise that a single failure could unravel the entire operation. Midway Atoll would be attacked, drawing out the remaining American carriers. A powerful Japanese striking force would then ambush and destroy them in a decisive battle. It was, in Yamamoto's mind, Japan's last real chance. What made the plan especially dangerous was not its ambition, but the assumptions beneath it. Yamamoto assumed the Americans would react predictably. He assumed surprise was still on Japan's side. He assumed Japanese carrier aviation remained superior in experience and coordination. And perhaps most critically, he assumed that if Japan lost carriers, it could not afford to lose many. This was the silent clock ticking behind every decision Yamamoto made. Because unlike his more optimistic colleagues, Yamamoto already knew the truth. Japan was fighting against time, and time was not neutral. Now, with that context in place, we can return to the Pacific in early June 1942, where Yamamoto's plan was already in motion, and the future of the war was about to hinge on a single stretch of ocean. To understand how Yamamoto's plan unraveled, we need to meet the men who would carry it out, and the men who would unknowingly be waiting for them. At the center of Japan's striking force was Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commander of the First Air Fleet. Nagumo was not an aviator. He was a surface warfare officer, cautious by temperament, trained in battleship doctrine. He had executed the Pearl Harbor attack competently, but he did not fully trust carrier aviation as a decisive arm in its own right. That mattered more than anyone realized. Nagumo commanded 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same core force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. Their air crews were the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Many had flown combat missions over China for years. They believed, with justification, that no American carrier force could match them. But experience came at a cost. Japan had no system for rapidly training replacement pilots. Carrier air crews were treated as elite assets, not expendable ones. Every loss was permanent. Every veteran killed took years of institutional knowledge with him. The Americans, by contrast, were preparing for a very different kind of war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew he was outnumbered. He knew his carriers were fewer, his pilots less experienced, his margin for error razor thin. But Nimitz possessed something Yamamoto feared: time backed by industry. More importantly, Nimitz possessed information. American codebreakers had partially cracked Japanese naval communications. They knew an operation was coming. They knew its target was designated AF. And through a carefully staged ruse, a false report of water shortages at Midway, they confirmed what Yamamoto hoped to conceal. Midway was the trap. Only now, the trap worked both ways. Nimitz concentrated his limited carrier force northeast of Midway, positioning Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown where Japanese scouts would not expect them. Yamamoto's plan assumed American carriers were farther east. That assumption would prove fatal. And yet, even at this stage, the Japanese plan might still have succeeded, if not for a cascade of small decisions, delays, and misunderstandings. Nagumo's carriers launched their first strike against Midway Island at dawn on June 4, 1942. The attack was effective, but not decisive. Midway's airfields were damaged, not destroyed. Almost immediately, reports began arriving that the island was still operational and required a second strike. At the same time, Japanese scouts were late. One reconnaissance aircraft launched from the cruiser Tone suffered a delay. When it finally reported American ships in the area, its initial message was vague: surface vessels, type unknown. Nagumo hesitated. He faced a dilemma that Japanese carrier doctrine had never fully resolved. Should he rearm his aircraft for a second strike on Midway, or prepare them for an anti-ship attack? Switching armament took time. It required moving bombs and torpedoes across crowded hangar decks already cluttered with fueled aircraft. Nagumo chose to rearm for Midway. Minutes later, a follow-up report arrived. American carriers were present. By then, it was too late. As Japanese crews scrambled to reverse course, torpedoes coming out, bombs going back in, the hangar decks became chaos. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. Aircraft sat fully armed and fueled. The carriers were at their most vulnerable state. Above them, unseen, American dive bombers were already on the way. And hundreds of miles to the west, aboard Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto still believed the decisive phase of the battle lay ahead. He did not yet know that the battle had already been decided. In the next section, we return to the morning of June 4th, minute by minute, as expectation collides with reality, and Yamamoto's carefully constructed plan begins to collapse in a matter of moments. At 0920 hours on June 4, 1942, the skies over the Japanese carrier force were deceptively calm. Below, Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers steamed in formation. Fighters circled overhead. Lookouts scanned the horizon. On the flight decks, crews rushed to rearm aircraft amid mounting confusion. Orders had changed twice in less than an hour. Bombs lay stacked beside torpedoes. Fuel vapors hung in the air. This was not how Japanese carrier doctrine was meant to function. The first American aircraft arrived not in a crushing blow, but in piecemeal desperation. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacked first. Flying slow, low, and without fighter escort, they were massacred. One by one, their TBD Devastators were shot from the sky by Japanese Zeros. Out of 15 aircraft, only one pilot survived. From the Japanese perspective, this seemed like confirmation of everything they believed. American attacks were uncoordinated. American pilots were brave, but tactically unsophisticated. Japanese air defenses were working. More torpedo planes followed. They too were destroyed. The sea filled with wreckage and burning fuel. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers convinced the danger had passed. What they did not know, what they could not see, was that those doomed attacks had forced Japanese fighters down to sea level, pulling them away from the altitude where the real threat was forming. At approximately 1020 hours, American dive bombers arrived overhead. They came out of the sun. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading dive bombers from Enterprise, had made a decision moments earlier that would change the war. Low on fuel and uncertain of the enemy's location, he followed a lone Japanese destroyer racing north at high speed. McCluskey guessed, correctly, that it was rejoining the main carrier force. The gamble worked. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were transformed into burning wrecks. On Akagi, a single bomb penetrated the flight deck near the island, igniting fueled aircraft below. Fires spread uncontrollably. On Kaga, multiple hits detonated hangar decks packed with armed planes. Soryu was struck 3 times in quick succession, each hit compounding the damage. The destruction was absolute. Veteran Japanese aviators, men who had survived Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and months of combat, were trapped below decks or killed on impact. Firefighting systems failed. Damage control teams were overwhelmed. The ships that symbolized Japanese naval dominance were reduced to infernos in minutes. Vice Admiral Nagumo survived. His carriers did not. Only Hiryu, positioned slightly apart, remained operational. Its commander launched counterstrikes that would fatally damage Yorktown. For a moment, it seemed Japan might still salvage something from the catastrophe. But by late afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu as well. It too burned. And still, Admiral Yamamoto did not have the full picture. Communications delays, distance, and the sheer scale of the disaster meant that reports reached Yamato slowly, incompletely, and often contradicted by hopeful assumptions. Yamamoto initially believed the loss of 1 or 2 carriers might be balanced by American losses. That illusion would not last. By the night of June 4th, Yamamoto understood the truth. 4 fleet carriers were gone. Their aircrews were gone. Japan's offensive corps, built over a decade, had been destroyed in a single day. And for a man who had always measured war in terms of time and production, the implications were unmistakable. In the next section, we will examine the moment when numbers replaced hope, when Yamamoto realized that this was not a setback, but a turning point from which Japan could not recover. The night of June 4th settled heavily over the Pacific. Aboard Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto finally received consolidated reports. There was no longer any ambiguity. No optimistic reinterpretation. No fog of war to hide behind. 4 carriers were gone. Not damaged. Not temporarily disabled. Destroyed beyond recovery. For Yamamoto, this was not simply a tactical disaster, it was an arithmetic one. Each Japanese fleet carrier represented years of construction, years of training, and years of accumulated combat experience. The ships themselves could, in theory, be replaced, slowly. The air crews could not. Japan's naval aviation program had been built on quality over quantity, on an elite cadre of highly trained pilots expected to win wars through superior skill. At Midway, that elite had been burned alive in their aircraft. Yamamoto immediately ordered the operation terminated. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. Remaining forces were withdrawn. Japan would not press its advantage because there was no advantage left to press. This decision, quiet and unceremonious, marked the true end of Japan's offensive war. But Yamamoto's realization went deeper than carrier counts. He understood that the Americans had lost carriers too. Yorktown would soon sink, but those losses did not mean the same thing. American pilots had been killed, but replacement pipelines were already expanding. American shipyards were already working. American production curves were still climbing. Japan's were not. In the days that followed, Yamamoto reviewed estimates he had once used to argue against war in the first place. Aircraft production, steel output, oil access, training capacity. All of them now pointed in the same direction. Japan could still fight. Japan could still inflict pain. But Japan could no longer dictate the war's course. This understanding did not produce dramatic speeches or public admissions. Yamamoto was a disciplined officer. He did what Japanese doctrine demanded. He adapted. He began planning a defensive perimeter strategy. Rather than seeking decisive fleet engagements, Japan would attempt to slow the American advance through attrition, island by island, forcing the United States to pay for every mile in blood. It was a rational response. It was also an admission of defeat in everything but name. And even here, Yamamoto faced resistance. Many within the Imperial Japanese Navy refused to accept Midway as decisive. They blamed bad luck, poor reconnaissance, individual errors. They argued that Japan still possessed fighting spirit, Yamato Damashii, and that this spirit could compensate for material loss. Yamamoto knew better. He had seen American factories. He had seen American recovery after Pearl Harbor. He had seen, at Midway, what happened when industrial depth met operational opportunity. This brings us to the true turning point, not the explosions on the flight decks, but the shift in Japan's strategic posture. From this moment forward, Japan would react instead of initiate. And the next battlefield, Guadalcanal, would prove just how irreversible that shift had become. The true significance of Midway did not reveal itself all at once. There was no single meeting where Yamamoto stood before his staff and declared the war lost. No written confession. No dramatic resignation. What existed instead was something far more telling: how Yamamoto changed. In the weeks after Midway, his operational language shifted. Gone were plans built around decisive annihilation of the American fleet. Gone were ambitious multi-pronged offensives designed to lure and destroy. In their place appeared words like delay, attrition, defensive perimeter. This was the moment of realization. Not emotional, not theatrical, but absolute. Yamamoto understood that Midway had exposed a structural imbalance that tactics could no longer fix. Japan had gambled its irreplaceable assets, and lost them, to an enemy whose losses were already being replaced. Reports from Japanese naval staff officers make this clear. Carrier divisions that had once been the pride of the fleet were now non-existent. Air group rosters were filled with blank spaces. Training commands warned that accelerated pilot programs would produce quantity, but not quality. Yamamoto knew what that meant. Future battles would be fought by less experienced men, in fewer ships, against an enemy growing stronger every month. This realization crystallized as American operations resumed, not hesitantly, but aggressively. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal. From a purely tactical standpoint, the move shocked Japanese planners. They did not believe the Americans were ready to go on the offensive so soon. From Yamamoto's perspective, however, it made grim sense. The Americans were no longer waiting. They did not need perfect conditions. They did not need overwhelming superiority. They only needed to keep moving forward. And Japan could not stop them everywhere. Yamamoto threw what remained of his carrier and surface forces into the Solomon Islands campaign. The battles that followed, Savo Island, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, were savage, costly, and inconclusive. Japan often inflicted heavier immediate losses. But the pattern never changed. Japanese ships sank. Japanese pilots died. And American strength returned, again and again. By late 1942, Yamamoto no longer planned for victory. He planned for endurance. That is the revelation Midway forced upon him. The war was no longer about how Japan could win, but about how long it could avoid losing. And even that question already had an answer. The immediate consequences of Midway unfolded quietly, but relentlessly. In the months that followed, Japan's navy fought with skill and determination, but without the strategic freedom it once enjoyed. Operations were now reactive. Every major movement required caution. Every loss carried disproportionate weight. The margin for error that had existed in 1941 was gone. At Guadalcanal, this reality became brutally clear. Japanese forces attempted to retake Henderson Field again and again, often with courage bordering on desperation. Naval battles in the surrounding waters inflicted serious losses on both sides. But the outcome never changed. Japan could still fight tactically, but it could no longer sustain the fight operationally. Each engagement drained resources Japan could not replace. Strategically, Midway forced a transformation in Japanese war planning. The Imperial Japanese Navy abandoned the idea of a decisive fleet engagement that would end the war. Instead, it adopted a strategy of layered defense, fortified islands, attritional battles, and the hope that American casualties might erode political will. This strategy was not irrational. It was the only option left. But it rested on one final miscalculation, that American industry, manpower, and morale would eventually falter under the strain. They did not. By mid-1943, American carrier strength exceeded Japan's pre-war fleet. New pilots, while less experienced individually, operated within a system that emphasized survivability, rotation, and learning. Japan's remaining veteran aviators were scattered thinly across the Pacific, fighting a losing battle against numbers and logistics. For Yamamoto, the long-term impact of Midway was deeply personal. In April 1943, American intelligence intercepted his flight itinerary. His aircraft was intercepted and shot down over Bougainville. Yamamoto was killed instantly. He never lived to see the full scale of Japan's defeat, but he no longer needed to. Midway had already shown him the ending. Today, the Battle of Midway is remembered as one of history's most decisive naval engagements. Not because it destroyed Japan's fleet in a single stroke, but because it destroyed the illusion that Japan could control the pace, direction, and duration of the war. When Yamamoto stood aboard Yamato on June 5, 1942, absorbing the reports of lost carriers, he was not just witnessing a battlefield defeat. He was watching time itself turn against Japan. And once that happened, no amount of courage, sacrifice, or tactical brilliance could reverse it. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video. It helps ensure these histories continue to be told. If you want more long-form, documentary-style stories about the Pacific War, consider subscribing to the channel. These were real people, making real decisions, under unimaginable pressure, and the consequences shaped the modern world. We would also like to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what moment of the Pacific War would you like to see explored next? Thank you for watching. And thank you for helping keep these stories alive.